The year was 1835. Just days before Christmas, 110 soldiers marched through the Florida wilderness, their commander assuring them all danger had passed. They were tragically mistaken. A single, prearranged gunshot shattered the morning quiet, signaling an ambush. Before many could even reach for their weapons, over half the column lay dead or dying. This brutal efficiency marked the beginning of the Dade Massacre, an event that would ignite a bloody, protracted war. The people known as Seminoles were not indigenous to Florida in the manner of tribes with ancestral claims stretching back millennia. They were rather a confluence of Muskogee-speaking groups, forged by intertribal pressures and the expanding European colonial presence in North America. Prior to the formalized conflicts, later termed the Seminole Wars, observers described them as a people well adapted to their Florida environment, reportedly prosperous with significant herds of cattle, horses, and, reflecting the era's complexities, enslaved individuals of African descent. However, the seeds of conflict were sown early. Disputes between American settlers and Seminoles over the ownership of livestock and the status of escaped slaves escalated, contributing significantly to the First Seminole War in 1818. In that year, Andrew Jackson, operating under broad authority, crossed into Spanish Florida, an action ostensibly to control the Seminoles, but one that violated the existing treaty delineating Spanish territory. Jackson's invasion, justified by the U.S. government as a defensive measure against what he termed a savage foe, quickly evolved into a determined effort to wrest Florida from Spanish control. After protracted negotiations, Spain formally transferred the Florida territory to the United States in 1821. At this juncture, approximately 5,000 indigenous people resided in Florida. The ambiguous legal and political status of these individuals under American sovereignty became an increasingly untenable situation for the Seminoles. In an attempt to address this, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek was negotiated, establishing a reservation for the Seminoles. This measure, however, failed to quell the underlying tensions. A severe drought afflicted the region, leading to food shortages within the reservation boundaries. Consequently, Seminole parties began to venture outside the designated lands in search of sustenance. Further complicating matters was the continued presence of escaped slaves, who found refuge within Seminole communities, a persistent point of contention with American slaveholders and authorities. These combined pressures led American settlers to petition the federal government in Washington for the complete removal of all indigenous people from Florida. The government responded definitively. On May 28, 1830, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This legislation authorized the forced relocation of thousands of indigenous people from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to designated territories west of the Mississippi River. For the Seminoles, the implications were stark. An earlier treaty in 1823 had already significantly reduced their landholdings to a 4-million-acre tract in central Florida, critically, without access to the coast. The subsequent Treaty of Payne's Landing, pushed by U.S. commissioners, mandated that the Seminoles relocate to the Western Territories, present-day Oklahoma, within a 3-year time frame. A particularly contentious clause within this treaty stipulated that all individuals of African descent who had integrated into the Seminole tribes were to be left behind, effectively surrendering them to American slave catchers or authorities. The term Seminoles itself was likely an exonym, possibly meaning runaways or renegades, reflecting their composition as a composite group including Creeks displaced southward by Andrew Jackson's earlier campaigns and escaped slaves seeking freedom. In accordance with the treaty process, a delegation of Seminole leaders traveled to inspect the proposed western lands. Upon their return in 1833, they were presented with the Treaty of Fort Gibson, which affirmed their agreement to remove. While signatures were obtained, circumstances suggest that elements of duress were involved, and many Seminoles subsequently repudiated the notion that they had genuinely consented to abandon their Florida homes. In 1834, the task of overseeing the Seminole removal fell to General Wiley Thompson. He was appointed as the Seminole Indian Agent, establishing his agency near Fort King in the vicinity of modern-day Ocala. Thompson's methods and the overarching policy of removal solidified a resolve among key Seminole leaders to resist American encroachment by any means necessary. As the spring of 1835 arrived, the federal government increased its pressure, deploying troops and Indian agents to enforce the removal. Agent Thompson, after assessing the situation and the Seminoles' resistance, concluded that only the application of force would compel them to relocate. Throughout 1835, unrest and sporadic violence escalated, setting the stage for a more direct and widespread conflict. On the 23rd of December, 1835, Major Francis L. Dade departed from Fort Brooke, located at the site of present-day Tampa. His command consisted of 8 officers and 102 enlisted men, including elements of the 2nd Artillery, 3rd Artillery, and the 4th Infantry Regiment. Their objective was a northward march of approximately 100 miles to Fort King, near modern Ocala, to reinforce the existing garrison. The column also served as a supply contingent. Their route was the Fort King Road, a military thoroughfare cleared to a width of 20 feet through the Florida scrub and pine forests. The clearing was intended to provide an open passage, removing trees, palmettos, and other potential cover for ambushes. Unbeknownst to Dade and his men, their movements were under observation. For 5 days, as they progressed from Tampa towards Fort King, Seminole warriors shadowed the column. The impending attack was not a spontaneous act, but a coordinated plan developed by prominent Seminole leaders, including Osceola, Micanopy, Jumper, and Alligator. While Micanopy, Jumper, and Alligator positioned their warriors near the Wahoo Swamp and later the Palm Meadows in anticipation of an ambush, Osceola had a separate, concurrent objective: an attack on Agent Wiley Thompson near Fort King itself. On the morning of the 28th of December, 1835, Major Dade led his company out of a swampy area and into a stretch of open pine and oak forest. Believing that any likely point of attack would be at river crossings or denser terrain they had already passed, Dade made a fateful decision. He recalled his flankers. The intention was to quicken the pace of the march. This action, however, left his column more vulnerable, as they advanced directly into the killing zone selected by the Seminole commanders. The location chosen for the ambush was described by the Seminoles as a transition point, out of the swamp and into the pine, barren. The terrain featured scattered palmetto thickets and pine trees, behind which the Seminole warriors concealed themselves. The soldiers marched in a column of 2s, maintaining standard military formation for road travel. The morning of the 28th of December was cool, with temperatures around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light rain began to fall. Concerned about keeping their black powder dry, a critical factor for the flintlock muskets of the era, Major Dade issued an order for the men to secure their weapons beneath their heavy wool coats. Given that flintlock ignition systems required dry powder and a reliable spark from flint striking steel, the order was tactically sound in principle to protect against the damp conditions. After 5 days of uneventful marching, a sense of diminished threat likely influenced Dade's decision. As the morning progressed and the column neared the location the Seminoles had meticulously prepared, Major Dade addressed his men. He expressed his belief that the most dangerous part of their journey was behind them, reportedly telling them that upon reaching Fort King, he would grant them a 3-day respite for Christmas. Almost simultaneously, with Major Dade's concluding remarks to his men, a single shot rang out. This was no accidental discharge. It was the prearranged signal from Chief Micanopy to commence the assault. Immediately following Micanopy's shot, approximately 180 Seminole warriors, who had been concealed amongst the pine trees and palmetto scrub to the west of the Fort King Road, opened a concentrated fire upon the unsuspecting column of U.S. soldiers. The well-coordinated attack began swiftly. The first volley was devastating. Over half of Dade's 110-man command were killed or wounded in this initial fusillade. Major Dade himself was struck and killed instantly. The element of surprise was absolute. Few soldiers had time to retrieve their flintlock muskets from beneath their heavy wool coats, where they had been placed to keep the powder dry from the morning's light rain. Private Ransom Clark, one of the few survivors, later recounted that after the initial shot, which seemed to come from the front of the column, a heavy volley poured in from their front and left flank. It took several return volleys before the American soldiers could even discern the positions of their attackers. When the Seminoles did become visible, it was often only their heads and arms as they fired from behind trees and tall grass. Those soldiers still able quickly sought cover behind pine trees and began to return fire with their muskets. The company's 6-pounder cannon, a field artillery piece firing a 6-pound solid shot, was brought into action under the direction of Lieutenant William E. Basinger. Accounts suggest Basinger's crew managed to fire 6 or 7 rounds from the cannon. While this artillery fire reportedly did little damage to the dispersed Seminole warriors, its psychological impact was noted, causing the attackers to temporarily recoil or pull back over a slight rise in the terrain. This brief lull was not an end to the engagement. The Seminoles soon regrouped, preparing to press their attack and eliminate the remaining soldiers. During the temporary pause in fighting that followed the Seminoles' initial withdrawal, the surviving U.S. furrows soldiers, likely numbering fewer than 50, attempted to consolidate their position and aid the wounded. Under the command of Captain Upton S. Frazier, as Major Dade was killed and other senior officers were likely casualties, they began felling large pine trees with axes. Using the logs, they hastily constructed a small triangular breastwork. This makeshift fortification was reportedly 3 logs deep on its main western wall, with the northern and southern walls tapering towards the road and a nearby pond. However, the protection offered by this log enclosure was minimal. Descriptions indicate it was barely knee-high and offered little protection. A narrator at the actual Dade battlefield site later concurred that such a structure does not offer very much at all in protection. The Seminoles did not delay for long. They soon returned to the attack, fanning out and advancing from tree to tree, effectively encircling the beleaguered soldiers and keeping them under fire from their varied assortment of firearms, likely including muskets and rifles. Some accounts suggest the Seminoles may have also turned the soldiers' captured 6-pounder cannon against them, or perhaps employed a smaller artillery piece of their own, though the origin of this reported Seminole cannon fire is unclear. The engagement continued for approximately 5 hours, with a period of roughly 45 minutes separating the initial devastating volley and the Seminoles' renewed assault on the crude log breastwork. By approximately 2 p.m., the battle was over. All effective U.S. resistance had ceased. Towards the end of the fighting, Captain George W. Gardner, the company's second-in-command who had assumed command after Dade's death and was now grievously wounded, reportedly called out, "I can give you no more orders, my lads. Do your best." Lieutenant Basinger, also severely wounded, advised Private Ransom Clark to lie down and feign death as the Seminoles prepared to overrun their position. Once it was clear that no further resistance was being offered, the Seminole warriors entered the log enclosure. Accounts suggest that, believing all the soldiers to be dead, or perhaps choosing not to crown their victory with cold-blooded butchery, they moved through the position, taking weapons, ammunition, and other accoutrements from the fallen. It was noted by narrators that the Seminoles didn't take any scalps from this location, a practice sometimes associated with other Native American groups in warfare of that era. Seminole losses in the engagement were remarkably light. 3 warriors were killed and 5 were wounded. In stark contrast, Of the 110 U.S. officers and men who had marched from Fort Brooke, sources indicate either 107 or 108 were killed. The discrepancies likely relate to whether all who died of wounds later are included in the immediate battlefield toll. One soldier was wounded but survived initially, and one escaped unscathed for a time. The total immediate U.S. casualties were thus at least 107 out of the 110 who entered the ambush. Of Major Dade's original command of 110 men, only 3 are definitively known to have survived the ambush and its immediate aftermath. 2 of these, Private Ransom Clark and Private Joseph Sprague, eventually made their way back to Fort Brooke to deliver news of the disaster. A 3rd soldier, Private Edward DeCourcy, also initially survived, having hidden beneath the bodies of his fallen comrades. He escaped the battlefield with Ransom Clark. However, on the following day, as they attempted to evade capture, a Seminole warrior on horseback pursued them. Clark and DeCourcy separated to improve their chances of escape, but DeCourcy was overtaken and killed. Private Joseph Sprague, suffering from a wound to his arm, reached Fort Brooke on New Year's Day, the 1st of January, 1836. Being illiterate, Sprague left no written account of his experiences in the battle. The narrative of the engagement from the perspective of the enlisted U.S. Prague soldiers largely relies on the accounts of Private Ransom Clark, who, despite multiple wounds, managed to return to Fort Brooke. His detailed recollections provided crucial information about the sequence of events. According to a soldier at Fort Brooke on the 1st of January, 1836, 3 horribly mangled soldiers arrived at the post bearing the grim tidings. This likely refers to Clark, Sprague, and possibly DeCourcy before his subsequent death, or another short-term survivor whose identity is less clear. The final individual accounted for among Dade's command was Louis Pacheco, who served as Major Dade's personal interpreter and was an enslaved man. Pacheco's fate was initially unknown. He reappeared in 1837, nearly 2 years after the battle. Pacheco stated that he had been scouting ahead of the main column when he was captured by the Seminoles. However, his account was met with skepticism by U.S. authorities. Suspicions arose that Pacheco might have provided information to the Seminoles, possibly aiding them in timing and executing the ambush. Consequently, Louis Pacheco was later forcibly removed to the Western Territories along with captured Seminoles. It was not until 45 days after the battle on the 11th of February, 1836, that a significant U.S. military force, an 1,100-man contingent led by General Edmund P. Gaines, arrived at the site of the massacre. They found the bodies of approximately 105 of Dade's men still lying where they had fallen. Initially, the deceased soldiers were interred at the battlefield. However, in 1842, following the conclusion of the Second Seminole War, their remains were exhumed. They were reburied at the St. Augustine National Cemetery, located at the St. Francis Barracks, placed beneath 3 coquina stone pyramids that also mark the graves of some 1,300 other U.S. soldiers who died during the lengthy conflict. The immediate repercussions of the Dade Massacre were swift and violent. Several large plantations in the Florida Territory were burned, and numerous settlers were killed in retaliatory or opportunistic attacks. News of the military disaster reached Washington, D.C., reportedly shocking President Andrew Jackson. Jackson, who as a general had led U.S. forces into Spanish Florida during the First Seminole War, had played a significant role in the circumstances that led Spain to cede Florida to the United States. The Dade Massacre is widely regarded as the spark, or precipitating event, that ignited the Second Seminole War. This conflict would prove to be the longest and most costly of the Indian Wars fought by the United States. It lasted for nearly 7 years and incurred an estimated cost of $30 million, a sum equivalent to over $1 billion in contemporary currency. By the war's end, the majority of the surviving Seminole population had been forcibly removed to the designated Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Nevertheless, a determined contingent, estimated to number between 100 and 300 individuals, successfully resisted removal and remained elusive within the vast wilderness of the Florida Everglades. Over time, as this remnant population began to increase, the U.S. government eventually designated lands for their use within Florida. With limited external assistance, the Seminole tribe of Florida cultivated these lands and rebuilt their communities. It was not until 1957 that the United States government formally recognized the Seminole tribe of Florida as a federally organized tribe. The names of many participants on both sides of the Dade Massacre and the wider Second Seminole War are commemorated in place names throughout Florida. These include Osceola County, the town of Micanopy, Jumper Creek Wilderness Area, the Withlacoochee River, and Dade County itself, though Miami-Dade County's name primarily honors a later Dade. The completion of the Tamiami Trail in 1928, a roadway traversing the Everglades, marked a significant intrusion into the Seminoles' remaining Florida sanctuary, profoundly altering their traditional way of life. The events of December 1835 left an indelible mark on the Florida landscape in the course of American history. The conflict born from these tensions shaped the future for both the Seminole people and the expanding United States, with consequences that continued for generations. If you found this account informative, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with a related topic you'd like to see covered.